Welcome, panel. And what we're going to do for the next hour is we're going to have a series of questions. We have them broken down in different sections. And these questions have come from parents as well as our staff, and many of whom, of course, are parents as well. So we've broken them into several sections. One, we're going to have some general questions that we're going to direct to individual panelists, and they'll be free to, other panelists can jump in if they want. And then we have another section on scenario questions that are specific to specific circumstances. And we're going to ask them to address them as well. And then if we have time, our third segment will be taking questions from participants from the Q&A questions that you put on the Zoom this afternoon. So we'll do that, and then we'll finish up hopefully by 1 o'clock. That's our goal. So we're going to start by going to Lane. You're our first panelist with a question. And here's a question. What are some signs that a toddler or preschool child is grieving?
Thanks. And I just want to thank QCC for inviting me to this discussion. I think it's so important. So signs in younger children, those very young children, are going to look very different than it would in older children or adults. You will see behavior changes, in a lot of the time that will come in terms of regression. So maybe they were potty trained or potty training, and now they're having accidents. Maybe they just become more clingy and start acting at a younger age. You'll see a lot of separation anxiety. And we know that a child that feels a connection is old enough to grieve. So even babies and toddlers and preschoolers, they all grieve. They just show their grief differently. So you can look for those behavior signs. I would say the clinginess and sleep disturbances, that's a huge one too. And they might not be verbal yet, but if they are verbal, you may get those repeated questions, because we know children don't understand the permanency of grief sometimes till they could be 6 or 7 till they understand that death is permanent. So they may ask you the same questions. Well, when is daddy coming back? When is he coming back? Well, he died, he went to heaven, but when is he coming back? So there's a lot of that, and some magical thinking. So they think maybe they caused the person to die or go away, because, you know, in your child, you're egocentric for a very long time. So if they think if something happens in their world, they think it's directly related to them. So they need lots of reassurance.
Excellent. And that's a great segue to our second question that's going to Jeffrey. How common is it for parents to overlook signs that their young child is grieving or suffering?
Hello, everyone. I also want to thank you, CC, for having me here today as well. It's honestly very common, and not to the detriment of parents, right? Oftentimes the reason why things or these signs can be overlooked is because parents are grieving themselves. And so it really kind of takes a special attunement, you know, to really kind of stop in the moment to check on everyone, right? And so that's just another reason why it's important to check in with kids, because sometimes they'll surprise you, you know, with what they say or what their thoughts are about the grief. But it can be, like I say, quite easy to, you know, often I've often heard parents say like, oh, I think they're too young, or, oh, they probably won't even remember them, you know, they probably won't even remember this moment. And you oftentimes will find that children are very much so observant of changes in their environments, and are kind of very aware of, you know, things are different, you know, people are moving differently, the energy feels different. So it's always important, you know, to when you can to check in with the kids about how they're feeling or what their thoughts might be.
Lane, in general, what can a parent do for a child that is grieving from loss? And that loss, of course, can be anything from a pet to a loved one.
Yes. You know, first of all, it's really the warmth of the connection with the parent that we know helps children the most. So sometimes parents are so afraid of what they say or do, but it's really that connection. So keeping that connection strong, a lot of reassurance. Sometimes you might just have to co-sleep and sleep with a foot in your back for a while, just to reassure that child that you're not, you know, that you're there. So I think just a lot of warmth and connection, keeping routine as much as possible. And we know in families when there's been a death and that's hard. I actually lost my first husband when my kids were 9 months old and 4 years old. So I just want to share that this comes partly from personal experience and those very young children. So they need routine as much as possible. They really do thrive on routine. Again, there's reassurance, and I think we might discuss this later, but there are some good books out there to read with your child to help them cope and understand, because they really have to understand loss and death at some point too, when they're all, they have to be given those explanations in age appropriate ways. But I would say that warmth of connection, and they just need that one, trusting adult, that one adult. So that might be a grandparent, that might be anyone in their life that might have to take that role after a death. And I think the person in the chat, that was my daughters are in their 20s now, by the way. So it's many years ago.
Samantha, this one's for you. From your personal experience, can you share a situation to help the child who has experienced loss?
Thank you all, and thank you, QCC, for having me be here. One of the things that you have to understand is that grief is a reaction to loss, and you have to understand it's unique for everyone. It's not going to look the same for anyone. It's not going to look the same for anyone. So first, you have to navigate what is the situation that's going on, and you can never be prepared for the variety of emotions, from anger to sadness, and definitely age does make a difference in understanding. For me personally, taking a deeper dive into understanding the love languages of each of my children was definitely beneficial, because it helped me to understand how I could better support my children during their time of grief. But all of us in the community, as well as educators, if we understand the concrete supports that can be put in place that can provide that barrier or that buffer, it will allow the child to experience resilience. You definitely first have to take a step back and have empathy for yourself, and then have empathy for the child, because we know that when you're a child, you're not in control of any of the moving pieces that are happening around you. So you actually don't want to be the person that steps back and doesn't acknowledge your feelings. So transparency is definitely important, and children need to be brought into that conversation as well.
Lane, how does the grief process differ in very young children versus adults? Or is there a difference?
Well, there is a difference. And it is important to know that young children will grieve, have a longer time to grieve. So they will grieve as the age they are, and then they'll grieve at each developmental stage. They re-grieve, as I put it. And so they'll revisit, they have a longer time to revisit their loss over that lifespan, and they'll need new information and new education as they go along. But for very young children, I think it goes back to what I said before, that you'll see changes in behaviors before they might come to you and express verbally, especially if they're not really verbal yet, about how they miss the person. They will definitely you'll see it in behaviors. And that really goes through school age children, frankly, to teenagers sometimes, that you'll see it more. I know Jeffrey and I are on the same page. We're having a nodding fest with each other because I know he sees it in his practice regularly, that those anger outbursts, those temper tantrums. And so many parents will ask, well, how do I know they're just being 3? Or you could even substitute to the age 12, or they're grieving, because this behavior is so, appropriate maybe for that age. And I say you really don't. But the grief, you can't separate the grief from the child. So what they're experiencing is just going to come out in those ways. So you treat them the same. You have to have boundaries. It's not okay to hurt anyone. It's not okay to hurt yourself. But you also have to have empathy. So again, having that warm connection, but you will see definitely it come out in more behaviors and that repetitive question. So we think if we say, well, mommy died and went to heaven. I had a young girl who was 5 one time said, our mommy didn't die. She's in heaven. So she didn't understand death. And that's really important to convey to children in those age appropriate ways, that when someone dies, their body is not working anymore, that they are not hungry. They're not scared. They're not lonely. Because I had another little girl whose brother had died from SIDS. And she was really worried about him in the cemetery. So they drove by all the time and she said, Chase is there. We need to help. He's alone. I want to go see him. So she really needed that information. And you might have to repeat that information every day. No, Daddy died. I'm sorry, honey. We can't see him here any longer. And though I know those questions of faith are important, so then you impart those, they're hard. They're going to take a little while for the child to kind of separate those more abstract feelings to the concrete, but they really do need those concrete information as well.
So it sounds like parents really have to hang in there and be repetitive and have the tenacity to, okay, I've dealt with this, but we're going to have to deal with it every day, and sometimes for weeks and months. Jeffrey, during the pandemic, we've obviously all had many issues with regard to what we've all experienced in the last 2 years. Many parents have made every effort to protect young children. As everything is starting to open back up, how can a parent help their child transition back to childcare or large family settings or playgroups?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. A lot of kids are struggling with coming from doing virtual learning, and just their routines have kind of been thrown, into an uproar. And so having to deal with this added impact of loss has really affected a lot of children. Some of the things that I definitely suggest are, particularly when it comes to schools, just being really collaborative with the teachers and the school staff there, letting them know about the loss. If there are details that the child knows about the loss, letting them know that, because sometimes children would just blurt out, random things, right? Like the way that the person died, or that this person is buried in a certain place. That can be a little jarring sometimes with peers or things like that. So sometimes it's really good to kind of prepare the school staff on the front end about, what the child, might be aware of. Certainly talking to them about providing the child maybe extra breaks to look out for specific behaviors if you notice something, particularly if you notice new behaviors that have come up. Sometimes children will develop new challenging behaviors, right? So just being aware, since the passing, this has kind of come up. And also a big thing I want to talk to kids about is other people might have questions and they might want to know things, and it's completely okay for you to not answer those questions, right? We don't want children to feel like they have to kind of hold this, the burden of the weight of having to kind of be the answer, the answer pool for everyone who has questions about their friend or their pet or whoever has died. But also, if they feel comfortable, they can answer those questions, right? So some of that is also just modeling and kind of going through it with them to say hey, if someone asks you this question, how do you think you might respond? And then they can say, oh, well, I don't feel comfortable talking about that, giving them that space to practice with the parents and with family kind of before they, get around their peers and other groups. And additionally, I just want to add too, particularly when it comes with families, you guys can develop routines, right? And rituals around ways to remember that person. And that can be really, supportive for kids who are dealing with grief to also, see that being modeled by the adults in their lives.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeffrey. Samantha, you have a unique role as a foster parent. Can you tell us a little bit about the need and the resiliency of the children that are in your care?
Yes. One of the things that you have to recognize is that when children come into care, there are various situations that may have occurred. And we have to recognize that not only are children experiencing grief that can be the result of a death, but they are grieving specific attachments, which are secondary losses that play a major part as well. So it's important that we understand and think about the relationships when children come into foster care that they previously had. That child may have had a daily routine with a specific individual that provided support, such as after school care. Those things change the environment that the children are in. They're now going to be going to a different school. Maybe an after school program is fairly new. They don't know anyone. The daycare setting could change as well. So you have to take a step back and ask yourself, were they used to a grandparent or specific person they were in their home picking them up daily? One of the things is children have homework partners sometimes. When a child is removed from their home, it impacts them physically, mentally, and emotionally. And as children make decisions and navigate from one day to the next, day one is going to definitely look different from the week one, which is going to look different from month one. So you need to definitely take a step and reach out to the school, because they're going to be there the majority of the day. Talk to the guidance counselor. Make sure teachers are aware of the circumstances that are going on, not in a way to bring embarrassment, but a way of creating that supportive community. Because again, children have no control over decisions at this point that are being made for them or on their behalf. And this loss is going to be accompanied with the loss of their home, a change in environment, a change in schools, and actually acclimating themselves to the rules and things that are in your home. So definitely, resiliency matters. And kids in foster care have experienced significant hardships that can hinder their success as adults. So we have to make sure as foster parents that we put them in the best position so that they can cope, adapt, and recover from any of these challenges. And I would definitely add, last but not least, make sure you have at least 3 key ingredients. Make sure you're providing a caring relationship. You provide high expectations so that the child knows, I am there for you. You can do this. You will recover. And last, make sure you present opportunities for that child to participate and contribute what their needs are, their wants are, and the emotional state as they're navigating.
Good, very good. Excellent, very good. Before we go to the next section, I'm just going to open it up to the panelists. Anything with general questions that anyone else wants to chime in on that maybe you weren't directed? Any points you want to make before we move on to the next section?
I think Samantha made a really important point about those secondary losses. So especially during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of those. So they may have lost, experienced the death of a family member from COVID or another way that, it's just a stressful time, but then they're not getting their regular support at school. So there's a lot of things pandemic specific that have happened that have just altered how we live that affect children, but there's also secondary losses for children in general. Many times they move, they may be in custody of someone new after the death of someone in their family. And so I just think there's the death, but then there's all these things we lose it after a death too. So I think it's just really be important they may react more to having to move, at first than they do talk about the loss of a parent or someone, but that happens because of financial stressors also after a death, especially of a caregiver.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move to our next set of questions. They're scenario questions from parents about specific situations. And we're going to show the slides on the screen for the question. I'll read it in case any of our participants are joining us via audio. So our first question goes to Samantha. And the question is, I'm a parent with complex PTSD. What are some co-regulation methods I can use with my children when we're both triggered?
I'll jump in here. Something that's great that we teach, oftentimes in doing trauma-focused work, are just grounding techniques. And so when there are moments and times where you or your child are both triggered, it's great to practice grounding techniques. So sometimes we'll have a simple one where it's like, name 5 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can see, 1 thing you can smell. And what's going to be really important about this is to practice this when you're not in a heightened emotional state so that it becomes like muscle memory, right? You want to build that automatic response for you and the child. And then you can even go back and forth, right? It's like mom is going to name 5 things, the child is going to name 3 things. But that can be something that you can practice just like while you're out at the park or, while you're out doing anything. And then so that will kind of support both of you guys in that moment. And it also shows that, the child that like, I'm not the only person dealing with this, right? And so oftentimes they're often really more invested too when they see their parents also utilizing those same skills.
Samantha, anything to add to that? Up, you're muted. Samantha's still muted.
Yes, are you able to hear me?
We got it.
Okay. Triggers can include many different things such as sight, sound, smell, or thoughts that may remind you of the traumatic event in some way. So some PTSD triggers are obvious and others are not. Grief and loss can affect the brain and the body in many different ways, and it can cause different changes in memory and behavior. So definitely you want to make sure that you develop coping triggers and do them with your child, such as deep breathing, expressive writing, grounding, mindfulness, relaxation, self-soothing, and also social support. And if your local area does have certified peer specialists, that is definitely a great avenue and an intervention that can definitely help.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to question number 2. And this one is for Jeffrey. And we'll wait a second until we get it on the screen. Question number 2, should my young child attend a funeral or participate in the funeral of a loved one? I'm sure this is a question many, many parents ask every day. So
yes. And there's really no straightforward answer here, right? Funerals for young children can really provide that concrete, understanding, a lot of what Lane talked about earlier, that ability to see the body and to see like the body going into the ground and to like, and you can kind of talk them through that. But also funerals can be really emotionally charged for children, right? And almost to a degree, have levels of traumatic experience for them, right? Particularly if there's lots of crying and lots of heightened emotional reactions and things like that. So it's really about the personal choice of the family. Something I often talk to families about is that children grieving is very much a natural process, but it's also a learned process as well, right? Children will also learn how to grieve and what grieving looks like from those who are in their family. So I would suggest probably if it is going to be a really emotionally charged, funeral, that maybe the child not participate directly with everyone, but you find ways that either they can view the body or you can show them pictures, from the funeral that this, is the people who were there and this is what happened, or maybe even a video or something like that later. But it is oftentimes really good though for kids to be able to get some of those concrete and finite things that you do get at a funeral. Even if they can't stay the full time, even if it's just to do the walkthrough for them to get a few things, that can be really important.
I just wanted to chime in. I totally agree with Jeffrey. Also, especially if they're not extremely young, if you can, the 4 or 5-year-old, prepare them for, get them a choice, but prepare, you can say, do you want to go to the funeral? A 5-year-old may not have any idea what that's going to look like. So preparing them ahead of time And it just occurred to me, one of the things you can do if you have an adult that's not maybe related to the family, that doesn't want to participate in the funeral, is maybe a kind of a friend of a friend. This happened at my first husband's memorial. A friend of my sister's offered to come and keep my little girl around, but not right in the circle. We did a memorial at the park, which was different, but kind of giving and having that person where they could take the child out and play and walk around at any time. So kind of identifying when all those people that are kind of on the peripheral of your support system say, what can I do to help? That's a great way to help.
Okay. Let's go on to question number 3. And this one is for Lane. How do I deal with or approach my child about the loss of her father when she seems to be unaffected by it?
Well, I get this question a lot, actually, that my child acts like nothing has happened, goes on as nothing has happened. We know in children, sometimes you might not see a more critical reaction to a year or even 2 years after a death. So keep that in mind. Again, going back to what we've talked about, some of those grief reactions may be coming out in behaviors. So are you seeing a difference in their schoolwork? Are they having more trouble getting along with their peers? So that can be a sign that, yes, they are grieving, but they're not verbalizing it. So what I say is just to have open and honest conversations. Like someone, I can't remember, I think it was Jeffrey, modeling how you grieve. I'm having a really bad day today because I missed your father, but I'm going to be okay, because kids also need that reassurance that their caregiver is going to be fine and can take care of them, but also kind of that authentic grieving, like I really miss your dad today. Also, just telling stories of the person who died, just in a matter-of-fact way. Oh, your dad used to like hot sauce on his pizza. Do you remember that? Or do you remember that funny story? No, young children may not, but having pictures that you say, you can tell them stories. So kind of making that person a part of their life. We have a quote we say at Kate's Club: death doesn't end a relationship, it changes it. So we know that we can stay bonded to that person that died. So, but it's not unusual for children. Again, they grieve very differently. When they're at 5 and they've experienced a death, it's going to look different when they're 10 and they're reprocessing. So know that you may not see typical grief reactions right away.
Thanks, Elaine. Next question. This is for Jeffrey. As a teacher in the childcare field, how do I best assist children on the autism spectrum cope with grief and loss?
Yes, excellent question. This is unique, for many reasons, because children, with ASD do tend to kind of process information a little differently, right, than what we see with neurotypical children. However, a lot of the same stuff applies, right? So something, regardless of age, with those who are, diagnosed with autism, is they do respond very well to concrete information, right? So facts, figures, that types of things. So if you're able to provide space, to be able to, but I should say this: if you're able to provide space in collaboration with the family to get information about, the death or the grief or what has happened, you can create space and times throughout the day where the child can check in with you, can check in with a paraprofessional, someone where they can kind of talk about it. This is if they're verbal, right? If they're not verbal, then we want to look at providing them additional breaks for sensory input. We want to provide them extra time, to complete tasks, to be considerate that there might be other emotional things going on. You really want to look out for, like I say, new behaviors. While we definitely see it with neurotypical children, we often definitely see it with children with autism. And that's kind of usually a key, right? That something else is going on, that they might be grieving, because we're seeing these new atypical type behaviors. I really and highly encourage creating space or something, whether it's transitional objects, which are great for all children, they can have at school with them, to kind of remind them of that person, creating a memory box of some sort, even if it's, having a small little photo album, of things that they can remember from that person, and taking times maybe during art saying, hey, would you like to draw a picture of that person or that pet, or, whatever, the person experiences the loss is, and create a lot of visual cues so that they can, kind of keep those memories going. Those are definitely some things you can do.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Our final question in this segment, scenario questions, is for all of our panelists. What are some TV shows, books, and resources that are age appropriate for young kids about grief and loss? Whoever wants to jump in at 1, 2, or all three of you
Yes.
can respond.
Yes, I would definitely say that Sesame Street and Communities is a great resource because they have a variety of information on helping kids grieve. They have short YouTube videos as well, and they explain the process of coping with death of a loved one and how it can bring enormous challenges to the whole family. Of course, we know grieving never completely ends. However, it can become easier with the right amount of support. So they have various activities that explain or ask questions like what happened. And they have various creative ways in which you can make art, articles, not only for the parent, but any adult in the life of a child that can help them articulate and answer the difficult questions. Because we know that the grieving process and the way it is manifested is different at each grade level and at each age, there are many printables, videos, articles, arts and crafts that you can do. And there's also a way to build resilience amongst yourself. There are many great books that you can actually dive into that are specified, specifically preschool through age 8. But then there's that next step. What type of loss is the child experiencing? So at Alina Health, they have various information, like if you're dealing with the loss of a friend versus the loss of a parent, a sibling, a grandparent, or even a pet. So there are many resources out there. I will definitely provide it in the link. And last but not least, there is a book club which has a guide for parents. And the book definitely focuses on a journey to resilience from trauma to healing. And the book is called What Happened to You. I definitely recommend this book. The author is Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. But if you simply go to Children's Trust Fund Alliance, it is a great way to understand physically what is going on through that traumatic experience and how you can bring healing to yourself and the others around you by answering one question: what happened to you? And allowing you to work through those feelings of emotions that you may be experiencing during this time.
Thanks, Samantha. Those are some excellent resources. Jeffrey, Lane, want to jump in?
I'll jump in and then let Jeffrey, of course. It's okay. One of the books I like just to start with for fairly young children is When Dinosaurs Die. So that'll explain grief from in very concrete ways, and also in different faith traditions that some people might do this, some people might do that. So that's a very good early book, like early in the death. There's one for preschoolers that's called Is Daddy Coming Back in a Minute? And that's a really good book for very young children. So it explains, the author wrote it because her husband had died when her son was, I think, 4, and how she explained that to him. We do have a book list at Kate's Club. I believe I sent that out, that hopefully will be sent out to people earlier. You can always go to our website, www.katesclub.org, for that book list under resources. Also the Dougie Center, which is one of the first and premier child bereavement centers in the United States, has a lot of books and workbooks. So it might be a workbook on someone I know died by suicide, or someone I know died by homicide. So they have some of those specialty books. And I just completely agree with Samantha. Sesame Street has great resources, and they have those in English and Spanish.
Good, thank you. Jeffrey, you want to add anything to this?
Absolutely. I mean, they've already given so many great things. I don't have much, but definitely some of the, at least some books that I really love to read with children and to kind of help process grief. One of my favorites is The Invisible String. And there's also The Invisible Leash, right? So in case you've lost a pet, there's kind of a pet specific book. And then there's also, the other book for general grief and loss. And they also have workbooks as well that are tied to the invisible grief storyline that you can, do activities with kids. There's the Memory Box, which is another good one. And one I love for preschool children, because I know people often look like, what can I do with a really small child? There's a book called The Goodbye Book. That talks about, kind of grief and loss, at a very young and kind of age appropriate way. We're lucky to have so many movies that kind of deal with issues, but I know if parents are looking for opportunities to kind of maybe do movies, particularly if you have a kid that maybe like, I don't want to sit through books. Certainly movies like Coco, which we kind of know was a huge movie that came out that really talked about death from a cultural perspective. Big Hero 6 is another one. And I love Land Before Time. That's one of my favorite movies that kind of really deals with grief of parents that you can kind of really be able to talk with children with. And I encourage them to add in extra movies like Inside Out, because the emotions piece is always tied to everything, right? You can always utilize those skills to kind of bridge the gaps between, are you feeling fearful? Are you feeling angry? Are you feeling sad? Do you have moments of joy? And you kind of can really tie those two together.
Very good, thank you. We will be providing, we'll be sending an email out following this to all the participants, and we'll be putting links and resources and a lot of things that you heard verbally right just in the last few minutes will be available to you. But please, if you're listening to this again or listening to the recording, there's a ton that there's a lot of stuff that just happened in the last 5 minutes. So I hope you're able to get that, parents. They should be really good resources for all of you. Okay, that concludes our scenario section, and we do have some time to take some questions from the Q&A section of the Zoom. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Norma Vasquez to ask some questions of the panel. Norma.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So we have a couple of questions from the chat and Q&A. The first one, and this is directed to all the panelists, is can the panelists tell us how important is extended family and the community to healing?
Well, I'll jump in here. I know Lane gave a great example of this, right? What, to be able to hold capacity in ways that you, as maybe the primary caregiver, cannot. I think it's also important, very much so, like I said, that children get kind of varied also views of grief and the grief process and how people grieve, that they have multiple points of check-ins, right? Because sometimes, parents don't have the emotional capacity. And I think it's really hard for parents to tell that to their kids, right? To say, mommy can't talk about that right now, or daddy, I don't have the space to, but you can really be able to use your extended, networks to say, hey, won't you check in with aunt or uncle or, your godparents? I think they might be able to kind of help you, or even to plan days where you kind of get respite care, and then they can, kind of do other things or create new rituals and, opportunities with other loved ones as well.
Thank you.
Sorry, I would just chime in to say it's important for those caregivers as parents to ask for help. And sometimes in our parent group, we have to rehearse. How do you ask somebody for help? And my rule around that, if people offer and they really mean it, they will be glad you asked, and they will do the task you asked, whether that's childcare or something else. If they didn't mean it, if they were just being polite, they won't ask you again and they won't take you up on that offer. So you really do need that support. We do a support wheel sometimes at Kate's Club with children and parents. Who is in my support wheel for those different needs? It's very important.
Thank you, Lane. Do you have something else, Samantha?
Yes, I would add that definitely you want to make sure that you incorporate at all times your language, culture, and history in the way that you approach the situation. We have our indigenous communities, but those are ways to bring your culture and the way that you respond to adverse situations to the forefront. And it builds, it's relationship building. It allows them to have something that they can pass down. You can pass that down from grandparents to parents and parents to their children. But definitely you want to make sure that you bring in those cultural values and tap into your roots. And it will definitely allow you to explore and understand things from a historical point of view and create that dialogue so that you're building new memories to help you be resilient.
Thank you, Samantha. Next question. How can we as clinicians help children who have experienced multiple death loss during the pandemic now returning to traditional school settings?
I guess I'll jump in here again too. That's a really great question, right? Something that's going to be really important with that is to really normalize that, right? In the context of the world that we've been living in, right? That many people have lost many people. You are also one of those people. There are lots of people who you can relate to, right? There will be people that you'll be able to connect to and share your story with that will absolutely understand. It's really going to be, important to, again, also, like I say, do that collaborative work with the school, with your teachers, to have them even hold space in the classroom. Because the thing is, they will not be the only kid at school, that's dealing with it. So if there's any opportunity that either the school can be really, how do I say, they can kind of take the initiative on some things as well. Sometimes they just need parent input, right? Or to hear from the parents that, oh, wow, we have a lot of kids dealing with this, to set up some things, but they can bring in counselors or have their school counselor do check-ins with students or whole groups, grief groups. That would be, those are some, pretty kind of easy things you can do, but that are really, really impactful.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. Lane? Yeah, I just really agree with Jeffrey. And I just wanted to, like at Kate's Club, we do school groups out in the Metro Atlanta community, and we're hoping to expand that throughout Georgia in different areas. So having those grief groups at school can be really powerful, because a child might not know that another child is coping with the death of a loved one as well. And I think providing families, providing children some of that ritual that might have been lost, if they can, as clinicians, is really important too. So can we go, can we do something more ritualistic that would help you say goodbye? Because many people didn't get the chance to go to a funeral or a memorial. And there is this lack. I don't think you ever get closure, but I think mourning collectively, culturally, we're meant to mourn together. And different cultures have different traditions, like Samantha said, but some of that was lost during the pandemic, our way of collectively mourning. So I find adults and children are having a lot of issues with that.
Thank you. Samantha? Do you have to?
Yes, I would definitely add, during the pandemic, from December 2019 through the entire year of 2020, my family experienced a death each month. We may have skipped 1 month, and going through that, I realized that it's not normal. We don't want to normalize death. We definitely want to normalize resilience. And in order to do that, you have to understand and participate in things that help you to understand what the 5 protective factors are. Each of the 5 protective factors is essential, but most important, all of them helps you to build strength and stability for families. And parent resilience can come in any form, from basic needs and concrete support, and it could show up as social connection. So one of the most beneficial things was participating in parent cafes. It allowed me a safe space to be transparent, to share what I was doing. I was able to take off that leadership hat and say, I am struggling, and acknowledge all the feelings that I was having, because as a parent, we are the sole provider. However, sometimes we hide those emotions. We don't want the emotions to be one thing that is an extra added stress to a child. However, it can be a way in which you explain to the child that you're going through the grieving process. Again, we're not necessarily talking about just loss of loved ones, but loss of possibly your home, your community, and various things. So I would definitely suggest jump into one of those 5 protective factor cafe models. Get out there in your community and understand definitely what those 5 protective factors are. Everything from parental resilience, social connections, knowledge of parenting and child development, concrete support in times of need, social and emotional competence of children, and then share it with somebody. Once you learn and you understand, you find out things, how can you benefit your next door neighbor? And from there, the word will spread. But definitely, I would suggest the cafe model is great, and participating in those resilience meetings, one thing that was very beneficial. And I was able to be safe during COVID because it was virtual, but definitely understanding those.
Okay, thank you, Samantha. We have time for just one question. And just a second. Okay, should I be hiding my grief from my child?
I'll go first. I think I might have touched on this a little, but I think we all agree on the panel that you have to be authentic in your grief, and show that modeling of healthy grieving. We know just from research that children who have a parent that can't cope at all, that takes to the bed and is overcome with grief, is not functioning, do not do well. But we also know that children whose parents' message is, oh, everything's great, everything's fine, and hides their grief completely, they have issues as well. I'll be on parent interviews and they'll say, I don't know what's wrong with my child. He doesn't cry. He doesn't show his tears or fears or anything. He doesn't talk about it. And I ask them how they're coping, and they say, oh, I'm just strong. I never cry. I never break down. And so you can see how the parent models the grief is really important for the child. So being authentic in the grief, but also reassuring the child that you're going to be okay, that your family's going to be okay, that you're getting your support, that you can still take care of them.
Yeah, and I really want to add to this, just from a personal narrative. When I was 5, my mother lost my younger brother at the age of 2 months. And I remember going through the grief process and no one talking to me about my grief or if I had gone through anything. And also, I really remember no one talking about it. Like no one really, I never saw my mother cry, which is kind of weird because it's like you lost a baby. Like now as an adult, I'm like, yeah, like you should feel something about that. Or even my father cry. I mean, it was years and years and years later. Ironically, not until I graduated and we went back to the place where my mother got the call about my brother passing that I actually saw emotion from them regarding the grief. So it's really important that you really provide like that safety net of it's okay for you to cry. It's okay for me to cry. We can cry together. But certainly, you know, in the realm of if anyone has seen the Never Ending Story, you know, with Artax, you know, being stuck in the lake of sadness, like you don't want to be overcome with your sadness, but it is okay to release it because we have to release it, right? We need to let it go. We need to get that out. And the kids are really going to get that from you first before they get it from anyone else.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Norma, for this, for taking some questions. I'm glad we were able to get to a few of the questions that came in via Zoom. We've been indeed very fortunate today to have our panelists, Lane, Jeffrey, and Samantha with us. And I thank them. We couldn't have asked for a better panel, and they have all supplied wonderful resources for all of us. So thank you. Also want to thank again our sponsor, Carter's, for their continued support of QCC. And also mention to you that we will be sending all of our participants an email in the next day or so that will list some of the links and resources that our panelists mentioned. And here, on your screen, you'll see the QCC resources. We have a texting program. Twice a month, we send out texts to over 6,000 subscribers, parents who want to know more about parenting, child development, upcoming parent events. And then we also have obviously our call center, which is the bread and butter of our particular team. If parents anywhere in Georgia want to get help with finding childcare, they need to just call 877 All Georgia Kids. So those are some resources as well. And we hope to continue this dialogue and support for parents. We're going to be working with Kate's Club in the future, so look for that as well. And obviously, we're always looking for money here at QCC, donations. If anyone wants to consider a donation, we are a nonprofit organization. You can do that by going to our website at qccdonate.org. So again, thank you all for a wonderful webinar. We hope to repeat or have an additional webinar this summer. And so look for that. The date and the topic is to be determined, but if we can find a topic and a panel that is like the one we had today, we'll be in good shape. So I want to thank again everyone who participated. Thanks to the staff of QCC for helping with all of the back channel kinds of support they offered, and particularly our panelists. And again, thanks again for participating. Good afternoon.